I'm out and about today to see how autism affects everybody. So let's see how it does. What's your name?
My name is Aisling Culreevy and I'm the coordinator of Galway Autism Partnership.
Right, Galway Autism Partnership.
That's it, or GAP for short.
GAP. Mm-hmm. Is there a gap in the market for this autism thing?
Good one, yeah. So actually, funnily enough, that is the reason why GAP exists. It wasn't invented for that pun alone, but it was in around 2011. There was a group of parents who all had children diagnosed as being on the spectrum, and they got together and they realised there was very little in the way of services provided by the government, the health services. So a lot of them were on waiting lists for interventions or therapies, and they kind of banded together over a kitchen table and they said, well, at least we can do is have a group that goes to play centres together, or we go to the cinema together, so at least, strength in numbers, that kind of thing. So it really took off from there, and as you said, there was a huge demand. There was a lot of parents who found themselves in the exact same situation where they were on waiting lists of 2 or 3 years. They were often paying privately, and in terms of social and leisure activities for their kids, there was just very little available. So after it was set up as a parent group, it kind of grew from there. It became a registered charity in 2012, and then it started to offer these social clubs for autistic children and teenagers. Nowadays it's still a parent-led charity. It's also led by autistic adults who are on the board as well, but the focus is very much about filling in that gap. There is very little available in Galway and the west of Ireland. Now, I don't know how it is in the rest of the country, but this side of the country there's very little in terms
So
of
even though it's
services.
Galway, do you get others from like the Connacht or North Limerick area?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So we would never turn anyone away. Now, if someone can travel to our services, they're more than welcome. We get phone calls from all over the country. We get phone calls from Donegal, Cork, everything. And it's generally the same thing. It's parents who have a query or they're looking for support, and nobody else would answer their questions. So they do a quick Google search and our name comes up and they give us a call.
So like 2011, the parents banded together, like I said. So that was like, I suppose, the cutbacks. Was there cutbacks, we'll say, with regard to funding? You mentioned privatisation and people, going to private things like therapies and that.
Yeah.
So was it I suppose, a real need for GAP because of that?
Yeah, I suppose. Now, again, it depends on who you ask, and everyone has a different position. Everyone's got a different set of circumstances. I think autism has always been a life-changing diagnosis for individuals and their families, and it's never been that widely recognised, but we do know from research actually done in NUIG that the average loss of income per family per autistic child is €28,000 a year. So that gives you an idea of the kind of the financial situation that families find themselves in. And when you add that to like the recession, the cutbacks, it just makes the situation completely untenable. And there's one thing about autism, is that it's an invisible disability, so you can't see it when you look. So technically, to get a diagnosis, it's these behavioural tests and a lot of questions, a lot of interviews. It's time consuming, it can't be done with a blood test, and it's costly. So again, in terms of getting your child assessed and diagnosed, that takes time, that takes money. So as a result, when people are going public, they find themselves waiting, maybe up to 18 months, maybe longer. So things like staff cutbacks obviously affect that. And then the same teams that are charged with assessing autism in people are also the teams that are responsible for delivering intervention. So it's completely unrealistic. Very, very few people that we support would receive, I suppose, regular intervention, if anything at all, in terms of like speech and language or psychology services.
This looks like an expensive operation. Like there's lots of different rooms and it's a building all for autism. Like who pays for all of this?
So GAP is entirely self-funded, and that means we don't receive any multi-annual state funding. We might receive the occasional grant or project-based funding, which is hugely helpful, and it tends to expand what we can do. But it's finite. So in terms of keeping this operation up and running, we rely on bucket collections, fundraising, donations, everything, you name it, we try it. So we always say we're one of Galway's hardest working charities
Yeah.
because we literally have to raise every single cent. Every cent goes back into GAP, it's used within Galway. So for the likes of local organisations that support us, I think they like to see that it is kept local within the community, and we make money go really far. We do a lot with very little. So to run a 6-week term of clubs for up to 6 children, it costs about €300. So
Wow.
that sounds, to some people that's a lot, but when you think that these children have no access to intervention, psychology services, and they can't attend general youth clubs, that's really, really meaningful, and it's a lot, it's a big investment, I think, in their future.
So what in general is autism?
That's the $1 million question, isn't
Yeah.
it? And again, the best person to ask would be an autistic person, which I am not. But I suppose at GAP, we view autism as it's a way of being different, to put it very, very simply. To put it a little bit more complicated, it's a neurological difference. So it's how a person's brain works and how they process information, how they take in information from the world around them. So their brains works differently, cognition, how they socialise, how they communicate, completely different to a non-autistic person. So while autism is classified as a disability, technically at GAP we take the perspective of it more as being a difference or a way of being, and it's equally valid. There's nothing broken about an autistic person, there's nothing bad about an autistic person, but unfortunately because they have to survive in a world that doesn't really meet their needs, we find that a lot of autistic people face a lot of challenges in day-to-day life.
So autism is a word you often hear, like, and your terminology here is Galway Autism Partnership, but there's like ASD, Autistic Spectrum Disorder. What does that encompass then more so?
So again, linguistics are always changing, and if you were to ask me 3 years ago, it probably would have been something different. And there's also that debate about autism and Asperger's. Are they the same? Are they different? So if you were to ask a medical professional, they would say the ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, is a range of disorders or disabilities, and that encompasses autism, Asperger's, Rett's disorder. A lot of the autistic community just prefer to refer to themselves as autistic, but some people take a lot of pride in the diagnosis of Asperger's. All of that can be very confusing when you're on the outside looking in. It can be very confusing when you're in the community as well. Some people have an issue with the word disorder, some people don't like the word disability, some people are proud to call themselves disabled. So while you do run the risk of sometimes, I suppose, isolating people depending on the language that you use, GAP really prefers to just say autism.
Yeah.
We think that's kind of the easiest way possible to explain it.
And in GAP you have that word partnership, and obviously the parents that came around the table in 2011 and that are huge in this, and families are huge. And you mentioned, you know, the worldly perspective of autistic people and children and young people and stuff. So does the feelings not just of autism and the neurological disorder or disability or whatever condition, whatever we put, you know, whatever slant we put on it, does that run into families insofar as how it stresses families or how it takes families' lives over? Is it very time consuming in that?
So, good question. So again, to kind of fall back on the research, studies show that the stress experienced by families of autistic people is much higher than other types of disability, including Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, things like that. So much, much higher. And depending on how you were to interpret that research, you could think, oh, an autistic child is a burden or a stress. But obviously that's not the case. If you talk to these families and these parents and you unpack what is actually there between these figures, it's the lack of support, the lack of intervention, the worry over how your child will grow up without what it needs in the world. So the parents that come in here tend to be in a high state of anxiety, distress, very agitated. But it's not because of their child. They've been with their child from the moment it was born. They know them better than anyone else. And while every family has its ups and downs, and you know, there's there can be stressors, they don't want to change their child. They want to change how the world sees their child. They want to change how their school accommodates their child. They want to get the services that their child needs. So yes, the rates of stress are extremely high. but it's not because autistic people are stressful, you know. And again, if you were to say to the adult autistic community, really, really high rates of stress within the stress, anxiety, depression, mental health issues within the adult autistic community. Being autistic isn't a mental health issue, but existing in a world that constantly makes you feel uncomfortable and othered, that is
like
traumatic.
the social interaction and the lack of awareness of
That's it,
society
yeah.
in general.
People just being rude, isolating, bullying in schools, like the kind of things that the people that we work with have to go through. It would stress anyone out.
Other than the autism itself.
Other than the autism.
Yeah.
A lot of autistic people are really happy to be autistic.
Yeah.
They're proud of it, and they can see, you know, they can see the challenges that they have, but they also see the value that autism brings to their life. So autism isn't inherently this bad thing or something that ruins someone's life. But when people around you treat it like that, that's when it starts to have a negative impact on your mental health.
And you mentioned schools there, and obviously cognition and that. What are the linkages that you guys give to schools, or do schools ask advice, or how does that work?
Yeah, so again, the partnership part of our name, we work really closely with schools. So we visited schools all over the city and county delivering our presentation, and it's called Autism, What is Unique is Wonderful. So we deliver that to students, both autistic and non-autistic students. And the whole idea behind it is, number one, to understand and have a little bit more awareness of autism and what it means. But also, number two, how you can support and welcome anyone who is a little bit different. So an autistic person, somebody who maybe English isn't their first language, they come from a different country, they practice a different religion. We kind of talk about how it's important to embrace differences of all kinds and what you can do to make your school a more welcoming place. Because honestly, I believe you don't have to have an encyclopedic understanding of autism to be kind to autistic people.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone in school needs that. I don't think general society needs that. You just need to be kind and patient and open to other people's differences. We also work closely with staff, and we would deliver training around autism awareness and strategies that could work with autistic kids.
Okay, cool. And what about society in general? Like you mentioned children, young people with autism and that. Did you also mention older people, like adults? Do you think there's people out in society, and you also mentioned prior to that about how it's difficult to diagnose, there's so much involved in diagnosis of people with ASD, but in general society, even when you were growing up, because this gap is only here since 2011, do you think there's a percentage of people that have autism that perhaps don't know it or are undiagnosed or whatever?
I would say it's really, really underdiagnosed, which people might argue with because the diagnostic rates tend to be going up and up every year. And people say, you know, is there more autistic people? I don't personally think so. I think it's that people have more of an eye for detail, they're more aware of autism and what it is, what it looks like, even though they may have misunderstandings about it, they seem to have a little bit more knowledge about what it is. Schools and parents tend to be more aware of it, and I think people are getting assessed more often. So absolutely, there are probably thousands of undiagnosed autistic adults in Ireland and probably millions worldwide. Absolutely, because I think if you look at autism and you have this narrow view of it's something a young child has, they might have an intellectual disability, they may be non-verbal, they might have behaviours that challenge. That is only one type of person, that's only one form of autism. But there are autistic people who grow up to be actors, they study in college, they get jobs. Whether they're diagnosed or not, they're still autistic, they just haven't got the
So what
paper.
actors or famous celebrities are autistic?
So a few of the famous people who are autistic, I include this in the presentation I do in school. So Dan Aykroyd is autistic, Ghostbusters. Daryl Hannah is autistic, and again that's important because people don't tend to think of women and autism. Who the inventor of Pokemon is autistic. I'm going to butcher his name. Satoshi Hajiri, I think is his name. Yeah, and then probably the most kind of relevant, Greta Thunberg. Have you heard of Greta?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So she's like kind of an icon to everyone, and she has actually said in interviews, if it wasn't for her autism, she wouldn't do what she does because the way her brain works, she's not able to sit idly by and just kind of switch off and say, it'll be fine, it's not my problem. She literally can't rest until she does something about it. So I think that's a wonderful example of what an autistic person can do when they're supported and encouraged. And you'll get haters. I mean, you've seen it recently there in the media where she spoke to the UN convention and people were saying this is a child with a mental disorder and she's being abused, and that's not what I saw. I saw like an extremely passionate, emotional person who has done her research, who has come halfway across the world to stand up in front of people. I didn't see somebody who was losing their temper or having a meltdown. I saw somebody who was passionate and wanted to get that message across. And I think when her detractors say that's a mental health issue, as Greta said herself, when they come after you because of your disability or your appearance, you know you've done something right because they can't come after you for anything else, So she's quite an inspiration to a lot of the young people that we would support.
And like a lot of those haters can be people in authority or in the media. Is that like, and these people, you mentioned Greta doing her research, these people surely have done some form of research or not. Is it that there's a need for more research in autism in general, or is there just like a huge lack of acceptance? Which is it, or what is it?
That's a really good question actually, and I think if you ask the autistic community, they will tell you they are one of the most researched populations in the whole world. And I read a figure, I think it said like every day there's a 30 articles published on autism or study related to autism. They don't need more research, they need the acceptance. People need to accept them for who they are. Stop trying to fit them into this little box about what you believe autism to be. Stop trying to get them to fit into non-autistic conformity. Accept them for who they are and embrace that difference. And when that difference is embraced is when you get the likes of your Greta Thunbergs and your Dan Aykroyds and your Chris Peckhams and things like that, who have been nourished and they've thrived in a society that's not necessarily designed for them, but they've carved their way out and they stand out from the crowd as a result of that.
Wow. Yeah. And like you mentioned those celebrities, and of course these are on television and stuff. And around this building Chirona, you have some lovely paintings and a lot of visual stuff. What has that got to do with autistic people? Like, do you put them up as staff, or is it just like some of them are made by, you mentioned earlier, by one of the former people that were here?
Yeah, so most of the artwork around the house is created by people who have attended the clubs and camps. So children aged up between 3 and 17 years, and then some of our adults as well. And not only is it lovely decoration for the house that we have here, it reminds us that every autistic person has a unique skill or strength. Not everyone is going to be an artist or a musician, but I've met hundreds of autistic children and adults, and everyone I've met has always has something unique about them that they excel at. So you might have somebody who is amazing with trivia, you want them on your pub quiz team every time. You might have incredibly talented artists. You might have somebody that's really, really good when it comes to mathematics, or they might remember facts related to history. But regardless of academics, you have people who come and they're really funny. They can make people laugh. They can make friends really easily. They might be good speakers. They might be excellent communicators. There's non-verbal children that attend the clubs here that can spell every word in the English dictionary. They can't verbalize it, but they use iPads to communicate. So what autism says to me is that brains and people's brains in general are amazingly complex. There's so much we don't understand about them, but that everyone has an innate ability and a strength that I think society will sometimes overlook.
Okay, cool. So, Aisling, thank you so much for letting us hear. So there you go. Until next time, please subscribe. If you haven't already, please do. Have a wonderful day.